Her name was Tamar, daughter of a king's sister to princes born into royalty, and yet remembered not for her lineage, but for her tragedy. Among the many accounts in the Bible, hers stands apart as one of the most unsettling, not because of divine wrath or supernatural signs, but because of the painful familiarity of human failure. Tamar's story, recorded in the 13th chapter of 2 Samuel, is a quiet storm that unfolds within the walls of a palace where one would expect protection, dignity, and justice. Instead, we witness silence, betrayal, and the collapse of moral responsibility. It begins, as many tragedies do, with unchecked desire. Amnon, her half-brother, claims to love her, though what he feels is not love, but obsession, dangerous, self-indulgent, and ultimately destructive. When that desire is fed by manipulation and opportunity, it culminates in an act of violence. Tamar is raped by someone from her own household, someone who should have been her protector. And the aftermath in many ways is even more cruel. Amnon, having taken what he wanted, immediately despises her. He casts her out not only from his presence, but from any sense of worth or identity she once held. We pause here not merely to lament the tragedy, but to recognize the layers it reveals. Tamar is not only violated physically, she is stripped of her honor, her voice, and her place in the narrative. Her father, King David, is said to have been furious, but he does nothing. Her brother Absalom offers her a place to stay, but not the justice she deserves. No one restores her dignity. No one pursues justice on her behalf. And from that point on, Tamar disappears from the biblical text. Yet the silence that surrounds her should not be mistaken for absence. Tamar's story speaks not with noise or vengeance, but with a stillness that indicts those who refuse to act. It is the story of a woman who suffered because others chose comfort over confrontation, reputation over righteousness. Why is this story in the Bible? Why would a sacred text preserve such a painful account? Perhaps to remind us that Scripture does not shy away from the reality of human sin. Perhaps to call attention to the enduring presence of Tamar in every generation, the forgotten ones, the silence, the abandoned. And perhaps most of all, to ensure that even when justice is denied, truth is not erased. Tamar's story is tragic, yes, but is also deeply human. And when told with honesty and reverence, it becomes a mirror that challenges us not only to grieve, but to reckon with what we too often ignore. Section 1. Sister Watson, a princess in a palace of shadows. At first glance, Tamar's life should have been one of security and splendor. She was the daughter of King David, Israel's most celebrated monarch, a man after God's own heart, the warrior poet whose psalms we still read today. She was a princess growing up in a royal court surrounded by prestige, influence, and the teachings of the Lord. To those on the outside, Tamar would have seemed untouchable, honored, safe. But we know that appearances can deceive. And what Tamar's life reveals is something deeply uncomfortable. Holiness in a family does not always translate to holiness in the home. The household of David, though chosen by God, was no stranger to chaos. Multiple wives, political alliances forged through marriage, and a growing number of sons from different mothers created a volatile environment. It was a house full of ambition, rivalry, and deep dysfunction. And Tamar, though innocent, lived within the center of this tension. Among her siblings was Amnon, David's firstborn son, next in line for the throne. From the outside, he was strong, admired, and charismatic, but inside something darker was taking root. The Bible tells us that Amnon was so obsessed with Tamar that he became physically ill. But what he felt was not love. Love never seeks to harm, manipulate, or consume. This was lust, self-centered, predatory, and utterly void of the respect that true love demands. The danger wasn't in a distant land, it was in her home. The threat wasn't a stranger, it was her own brother. And as we watch the story unfold, one truth becomes painfully clear. Even royalty cannot shield you from betrayal when the betrayal comes from within. Section 2. When desire becomes a weapon. The moment Tamar stepped into Amnon's room, everything changed. Amnon, following the advice of a so-called friend, faked illness and asked that Tamar be the one to care for him. It seemed like a harmless request. After all, this was her brother, and in her heart she likely believed this was an act of kindness, one sibling helping another. She had no reason to be afraid. But Amnon's intentions were anything but innocent. The Bible does not spare us the details. It tells us that once Tamar was alone with him, Amnon demanded that she lie with him. She pleaded, not just for herself, but for him too. "Don't do this," she said. "Such a thing is not done in Israel." Her voice was calm but desperate, filled with wisdom and reason. She begged him to consider the consequences, not only for her, but for his own name, his own soul. But he didn't listen. Because lust doesn't listen. It doesn't reason. It doesn't pause. It takes. And when it was done, when the violence had occurred, and Tamar's world had been shattered, Amnon did something even more horrifying. He turned on her. The text says he hated her with intense hatred, more than he had ever claimed to love her. He ordered her out like she was trash. Imagine that. Imagine the confusion, the humiliation. One moment you're treated like an object of desire. The next you're discarded as if your very presence is offensive. Tamar tore her garments, placed ashes on her head, and went away wailing aloud. Not quietly, not politely. She wanted the world to know something terrible had happened. She wanted to be heard. And yet no one truly responded. Her father was furious but took no action. The palace, for all its power and wisdom, did not rise to defend her. The justice she deserved never came. And so Tamar went to live in desolation in her brother Absalom's house. The tragedy is not only in what was done to her, but in what was never done for her. And that perhaps is what makes her story so haunting. Because for many people even today, that's where the pain cuts deepest. Not only in being harmed, but in being forgotten. Not only in suffering violence, but in suffering it alone. Section 3. The sound of silence. What happens when a cry for justice is met with silence? That is the chilling reality Tamar faced. She had done nothing wrong. She had spoken up. She had resisted. She had grieved publicly, tearing her robe, covering her head in ashes, letting her pain be seen. And yet the very people who should have acted didn't. The text says that when King David heard what happened, he was very angry. That's it. Angry. No confrontation with Amnon, no punishment, no justice, and no comfort extended to Tamar. He was angry, perhaps even heartbroken, but ultimately inactive. He said nothing. He did nothing. Some scholars speculate that David may have felt morally compromised. After all, how could he discipline his son for sexual sin when he himself had once taken Bathsheba and orchestrated the death of her husband? But whatever the reason, the result was the same. Tamar was abandoned. And her brother Absalom, though he took her into his house, told her to be quiet. "Don't take this to heart," he said. He meant to protect her, perhaps, to help her find peace. But what he asked her to do was devastating. He asked her to bury it, to live with it, to let it go. We hear that phrase even today, don't we? Let it go, move on. Don't make a scene. Don't ruin the family name. Just be quiet. And so Tamar went silent. She who once cried aloud in the streets now lived a desolate woman in her brother's house, isolated, forgotten. What do you do when the people who are supposed to protect you, your father, your brother, your community, tell you either by their words or their silence that your pain is too inconvenient to deal with? That is Tamar's question, and it is still a question the world struggles to answer. Section 4. Justice deferred, pain recycled. Tamar never got her day in court, but her brother Absalom never forgot. He said nothing for 2 years, not a word of accusation, not a hint of his plan. But deep inside he was watching, waiting, calculating. While Tamar mourned in silence, Absalom simmered in anger. And when the time was right, he struck. At a grand feast under the illusion of peace and festivity, Absalom had his servants kill Amnon. One swift act, revenge for the sister who had never been avenged. In his eyes, justice had finally been served. But was it justice? It's tempting to read that moment as a resolution, an eye for an eye. But when justice comes through blood and rage, it rarely brings healing. Absalom's decision didn't restore Tamar. It didn't change the culture that allowed the crime in the first place. It simply moved the pain forward. The house of David descended into deeper turmoil. The sons of the king were now at war with each other. The father, once silent, was now grieving 2 sons, one dead, the other in exile. The kingdom began to unravel, not from outside threats, but from the rot within. And Tamar, she disappears from the story. We hear no more about her life, her healing, her future. She becomes tragically a symbol of pain endured but not repaired. That is the haunting part of Tamar's story. She didn't die physically, but something in her life did die that day, and the world simply moved on. But you and I, we don't have to. We can remember her. We can listen to her silence. We can name her pain, and we can refuse to repeat the mistakes that left her broken and alone. Because Tamar's story is not just about what was done, it's about what was not done. And that is where we, the listeners, the readers, the believers, are called to respond. Section 5. The tragedy that lingers. If this were a story shaped by modern storytelling standards, this is the part where Tamar would rise. She'd find her voice again. She'd confront the king. She'd reclaim her dignity. She'd be restored. But the Bible doesn't give us that ending. There is no mention of Tamar's healing. No scene of reconciliation, no redemption arc wrapped in hope. She fades from the pages, swallowed by silence. And that right there is what makes this story one of the most tragic in all of Scripture, not just because of what was done to her, but because of what wasn't done after. Her pain lingers in the shadows. Her story stops, but the damage does not. And maybe that's the point. Maybe Tamar's story is told not because it has a happy ending, but because it doesn't. Because it forces us to sit with something we often rush past, the unresolved pain that many people live with. The kind of pain that never got justice, that was never acknowledged, never believed, never repaired. You see, some wounds don't scream. They settle into the quiet corners of a life and ache for years. And for every Tamar who weeps openly, there are many who suffer silently behind closed doors in familiar places, among people who will never know. Tamar's tragedy reaches beyond her generation. It touches every soul who has ever been betrayed by someone they trusted. Every person who tried to speak only to be told, shh, don't ruin everything. Every victim who carried their pain alone because those in power looked away. And as long as stories like hers are still being lived today, Tamar's voice must not be forgotten. Section 6. Why her story still matters. We live in a world that talks a lot about justice. But Tamar's story forces us to ask, what does justice really look like? Is it punishment for the guilty, protection for the innocent? Is it a system, a law, a verdict? Or is it something more personal? Something that starts not in courts or kingdoms, but in the way we respond to the pain of others? Because the truth is, Tamar didn't just need a king. She needed a father who would stand up. She didn't just need a brother who would get revenge. She needed someone who would help her rebuild. She needed healing, not just punishment. Presence, not just rage. She needed someone who would see her not as a problem to be silenced, but as a person to be restored. And maybe that's where we come in. Maybe the lesson of Tamar isn't just to grieve her story, but to let it change the way we respond to the stories around us. To the people in our own lives who carry invisible pain. To the ones who are still waiting for someone to believe them, to speak for them, to stand beside them. Her name is still in Scripture because God never erased her. Even if the world moved on, heaven did not. God does not overlook the broken. He does not dismiss the crushed. Tamar may have been forgotten by her family, but she was never forgotten by him. And neither are you. No pain goes unnoticed. No injustice goes unseen. The Bible includes Tamar's story not to depress us, but to awaken us, to stir our compassion, to sharpen our sense of responsibility, and to remind us that sometimes the most powerful response is not a throne or a sword, but a heart that refuses to look away. So if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever wondered whether your story matters, Tamar's story is for you. And if you've ever stood on the outside of someone else's pain, not knowing what to do, this is your invitation to step closer, to care, to listen, to stay. Because the most tragic stories become redemptive when someone chooses to respond with love. Section 7. A mirror to our own world. Sometimes it's easy to read stories from the Bible and imagine them as distant, almost ancient echoes, relevant once, but no longer tied to our reality. Tamar's story shatters that illusion. Her pain is not a relic of the past. It's a mirror. We see it today in headlines in courtrooms. We hear it in whispers at family gatherings, in the silence after someone shares a story too heavy for the room to carry. Tamar's story plays out in dorm rooms, offices, neighborhoods, churches, even in places where people sing about justice on Sundays, but look the other way by Monday. Her story reminds us that the failure to protect, the failure to act, is not just a personal wound, it's a cultural disease. And if we're honest, there are moments when we've been part of it. We've heard the story but didn't want to get involved. We've questioned the victim because it made things simpler. We've turned away from the mess because proximity to pain is uncomfortable. We've told someone to let it go when what they really needed was someone to say, I believe you. But Tamar's story won't let us forget. It won't let us hide. And maybe that's exactly what it's supposed to do. Because God didn't include her story in Scripture so we could look at it from a distance. He included it so we could enter it. Not to fix it, but to feel it, to let it soften our hearts, to let it convict us, and maybe even to prepare us to do better the next time we're called to stand with someone who has been hurt. Section 8. From brokenness to responsibility. There's a painful truth that sits at the center of Tamar's story. Some wounds won't fully heal on this side of eternity. Some wrongs will never be made right in this lifetime. Some names will fade from memory before justice ever arrives. But that does not mean we're powerless. If Tamar's story leaves us with anything, it's this: we all have a part to play. Maybe you're a parent, and Tamar's story challenges you to listen better, to protect more fiercely, to be the voice your child can run to. Maybe you're a leader in a church, a school, a community, and you've been trusted with influence. Her story asks you, what will you do when someone cries for help? Or maybe you're someone who carries your own pain, something you've never told anyone, and Tamar's story feels too close for comfort. If that's you, hear this: your story matters. Your voice is not a burden. And your silence, if you've chosen it to survive, does not mean your pain is invisible to God. Tamar didn't choose what happened to her. She didn't get justice. She didn't get the chance to rebuild. But through her, God gives us a choice. We can tell the truth. We can name the wrong. We can protect what's vulnerable. We can break the silence. And sometimes that's where healing begins, not when everything is made right, but when someone finally refuses to look away. So let's not look away. Let's remember Tamar not just as a victim, but as a calling to see, to care, to change what we can, and to never again be content with silence where there should be love, where there should be justice, and where there should be a voice that says, you are not forgotten. Section 9. What the Bible doesn't hide. There's something remarkable about the Bible, not in how it avoids darkness, but in how it includes it. Unlike sanitized religious texts that try to paint a flawless picture of faith, the Bible dares to show us the brokenness of its heroes. David, the giant slayer and psalmist, is also the king who failed his daughter. Amnon, heir to the throne, becomes a predator. Absalom, the avenger, is also the architect of rebellion. These are not caricatures. These are human beings. Deeply flawed, complex, capable of great beauty and great harm. And Tamar, the innocent, the forgotten, the silenced, she's in the story too. The Bible doesn't hide her. It doesn't erase her pain. And that is significant. You see, the inclusion of Tamar's story reminds us that God is not afraid of our worst moments. He does not look away from the cries of the violated. He doesn't censor pain to protect our comfort. Instead, he records it, preserves it, makes it part of sacred history. Why? Because he is a God who sees. The story of Tamar may not have a happy ending in the way we'd hope, but it has something else: permanence. Her name is there. Her voice is part of the word. And every time we read it, every time we speak her name, we're declaring that what happened to her matters, that she is not lost, that pain, even when ignored by man, is never ignored by God. And that in itself is an act of redemption. Section 10. Tamar's legacy and ours. We often define legacy by what people accomplish, by their victories, their influence, their success. But sometimes legacy is born through suffering. Sometimes it is carved into history by those who endure injustice, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Tamar's legacy isn't about what she did. It's about what she represents. She is a voice for the unheard, a face for the unseen, a name that refuses to disappear even when her story was buried in shame. And now her legacy is in our hands. Every time we choose to believe someone who's been hurt, her legacy lives on. Every time we speak up when it would be easier to stay silent, her voice echoes through ours. Every time we create a space where dignity is restored, where compassion leads, and where truth is welcomed, even when it's hard, Tamar is honored. Her story is a warning, yes, but it's also a calling to be better, to love better, to refuse the kind of passivity that allows pain to flourish in silence. You may not be able to rewrite Tamar's ending, but you can influence someone else's. You can be the one who listens, the one who stands up, the one who says, not again, not here, not while I'm watching. That's how healing begins. That's how justice is sown. And that's how we make sure Tamar's name, her true name, is not tragedy, but truth and courage, and the beginning of something better. Conclusion. When we choose not to look away, Tamar never asked for her name to be remembered this way. She never asked to become the symbol of stolen innocence or royal failure. And yet her story has lasted not because of its violence, but because of its truth, because it speaks to something in all of us. The longing for justice, the ache for protection, the hope that pain is not the end of the story. And maybe that's why her story is still here. Not to reopen a wound, but to awaken something in us. Because we live in a world still filled with Tamars, still filled with voices that have been silenced, still filled with pain, that never made the news, still filled with people waiting for someone to care enough to listen, someone to stay, someone to believe. And so we are left with a choice. Do we pass by her story, nod in sympathy, and move on? Or do we let it reach us? Do we carry it not as a burden, but as a reminder that love costs something? That healing doesn't come from rage alone or punishment alone, but from a radical willingness to sit in someone's pain and say, you're not alone anymore. The Bible never tells us what became of Tamar, but it tells us enough. Enough to know what went wrong, enough to know what should have happened, and enough to shape how we respond when the next Tamar appears, not in Scripture, but in our schools, our churches, our families, our lives. Let this be the moment we decide we will not look away. We will not stay silent. We will not leave the Tamars of our world to suffer behind closed doors and polite indifference. We will be the ones who remember, the ones who speak, the ones who choose love that defends justice, that acts in compassion, that stays. Because Tamar deserved that, and every Tamar after her still does. Let her story change the way we live. Let her name never be forgotten.